Hello guys, my name is Thiago and today we're gonna talk about how vulnerability detection works using InsightVM. So the very first step that you need to do when you work with InsightVM is to have a site. If you don't have, you have to create a site. The site is your virtual environment where all your assets will populate. How do you populate your assets? You need to enter the IP range, the host name, or just one IP address. You can use any way that you wish. And after that, you need to scan them. The product, it's divided into parts pretty much. We have the console, that's your web interface with the database, where all the information settings will be stored. And we have the scan engine that will perform the scan. Its function is to find the assets and perform the vulnerability assessment, pretty much. By default, the console has a built-in scan engine, but if you're gonna use in a production environment, where Rapid7 does not recommend to use on a very busy scan many assets at the same time, because you should deploy a distributed scan engine to do the job, because the problem is pretty much harder requirements there. And I'm not going to go deeper in that. So let's see how it works. So the very first step, as I said, you need to create your site. You can segment what you find in groups. For example, I would like just to see the vulnerabilities on my workstations. I can create a group. I can create a static or dynamic. The difference is the dynamic, the assets will populate automatically accordingly with the group scope. I'm going to show. So the same step that I will do would be go to create and the site. In this case, I'm going to go to home. So this is the result of my site. If you see here, I have already the assets that have been found, my desktop or my laptop, the server that InsightVM runs, even my own router. This is my Apple TV, and then going on. So if I click in manage site, it would be the same as go to create a site from the scope. The difference is already created. You can give a name, you can create tags that works almost likely a dynamic group or a static group. So if I created a tag in here, all the assets that will be found on this site will automatically have a tag added. So for example, I can create a tag and say that all the assets from home will have the tag home. So it means that they are in my home. Then I can easily find them if on the search tools. So assets, as I said, you can enter the scope. So I pretty much entered in here the scope. You can exclude assets that you don't want, but they still in scope. You can search just by asset groups and exclude by asset groups. So for example, let's suppose that in this range, I have everything, Cisco, workstation, servers, and I don't want, I need to create a second site, and I don't want to scan workstation. I just want to have one for servers. I can just, enter the same IP range and create a group, add all the workstations, and just leave in here. Authentication, again, I'm not going to talk about that now, but it's just if applicable, if you would like to authenticate to your assets. Cybersecurity best practice, it's to always perform authentication. Template, again, it will require a specific video. So we're gonna just use the full one, that's the full audit, that it has all the coverage for all the vulnerabilities. the scan engine that I mentioned. In this case, I have two. That is on my dedicated one, and this is the one that is built in with the console. This one is just a legacy one that doesn't work. Alerts, if you want to configure any alerts, if you want to schedule the scan. So I said about the group. So let's create a group. I prefer always to create a dynamic group because, as I said, depends what I have in scope, it will populate automatically. What I mean by that, so I can have 254 assets in this range. And if I'm just using 200 and tomorrow I'm going to add 20 more. So when those assets be scanned, they will eventually populate on the database, on the console, and they will, if it's applicable, in this case, if it's Linux on the OS, it will automatically populate on this group that I'm creating. So as you can see, I did create a OS contains Linux. I will create an asset group, which name Linux, because I just want to have a specific group to work with Linux device. In this case, it's a server or not. I can even refine more if I would like. So in here, I choose if it's dynamic or static. I can give a tag. So for example, custom tags, I'm gonna just give Linux. For example, criticality, if this was if all those Linux they were a very important server, I could just put as a very high, medium, low. Again, it's up to you guys. So I'm gonna save. And okay, this is the very first step. But I think what it's sometimes a mystery, it's exactly how the vulnerability detection works. And this is the purpose of this specific video. So we have two types of vulnerability assessment. We have a network vulnerability assessment, and we have authenticated vulnerability assessment. So the network vulnerability assessment, it will just perform an assessment on your vulnerabilities related to the network, as the name is saying. But what it exactly means, the very first step of any vulnerability assessment is fingerprint. So inside InsightVM or any other tool that you are using, Nessus, Qualys, if you are trying to perform a network vulnerability assessment, your result will depend of ports, open ports, services running on your environment. So if InsightVM cannot see open ports, it cannot perform the service fingerprint. If it doesn't perform a service fingerprint, it will not run the vulnerability assessment. So this is how it works. To give a better overview, so I have here Nmap. For you don't waste time, I have already a query here. So let's just type this command. So I'm pretty much in here trying to replicate what InsightVM would do against my assets. That's a Linux server. So pretty much InsightVM will Nmap will try to see if the port 22 is open. Obviously, to not just check for port 22, would check for what you ask in scope. I can ask just for the well-known ports. That's from one to, it's in total is 1024 ports, and you have a few high ports. You have the low ports, but again, this is not applicable. If you want, guys, you can Google. So just keep in mind that what you have in scope, it's what the scan engine will try to find. So let's suppose that we are just working with port 22 SSH. So if InsightVM wasn't able to see this port as open, it would not grab the service. So if you don't have a service, it cannot perform a vulnerability assessment. So the ideal is to always see this as open. If you get as closed, so maybe the machine is off. So then it could be expected. But the main issue is actually to get this state as filtered. It means that there is a firewall between InsightVM and the asset, the final asset. And in this case, you need to ask a network team to open this specific port, or what I would suggest, allow any inbound connection from the IP of your scan engine. This would be the best one. Then you have all the whole range, because today you can just scan the port 22, but tomorrow you want to scan another port. Then you have to do another request for your network team. So just keep in mind. So basically, this is what InsightVM I'm going to do. But for example, if you see, we don't have much information in here. So if we change this and put a version, so in a map now, I'm going to try to find the versions. So what I mean by version, each service, usually they have a banner on the running. So for example, on port 22, I have a service called SSH, and this service, it has a banner. And sometimes the vendor, the SSH vendor, the operational system vendor, would describe which operational system is, or give a hint. So in this case, you can see that's Ubuntu. I know this information is not accurate, because again, it's just a banner. This banner is more related to the open SSH other than the Ubuntu itself. So we would need to scan more ports for InsightVM. I know I'm not using InsightVM, I'm just using Nmap to give an overview. For InsightVM, be able to find more information. But this starts to give a hint how the network fingerprint works. So let's suppose that OpenSSH has a vulnerable version for any OpenSSH that is lower than 7.8. So if this was the case, InsightVM grabbing this banner would see that my version is lower than 7.8, in this case 7.6, and will flag me as vulnerable. So this is the importance to have the ports open and wide scope, not wild, sorry. And so this is just pretty much, after fingerprint the ports, it would perform the vulnerability assessment. That is just those conjunctions of rules that I gave an example. So if OpenSSH is lower than 7.8, so it's vulnerable. Obviously, this is a very limited vulnerability assessment, because it's not all application that you might have running on your server that will have a port, and they can still be vulnerable. They can. So how do you do that? Then you go to the next step, that's authentication. So pretty much the authentication will do the same step as the network vulnerability. The very first step is always fingerprint. So InsightVM will authenticate. We always recommend is to elevate the credentials. So what it means in Linux is to become sudo. In Windows to become a domain administrator and the local administrator. And when you do that, it is able to fingerprint everything that you have installed on your Linux server, for example. Tiago, I'm not understanding what you are saying. So I have an example here. So I have this command here. So this command will return everything that I have on my Ubuntu server. So let's just see. So if you see in here, and it is pretty much a brand new instance. So I have everything in here that is installed with the name and the version. So again, most of the vulnerabilities are related to running a vulnerable version of a specific software. So in this case, InsightVM can easily find, for example, if this wget, I think is a better example. If my wget has a version lower than 120, it is vulnerable. So by being able to run this command, InsightVM will fingerprint my version, and then it will perform a vulnerability assessment saying, okay, this guy has a version lower than 1.20, so he's vulnerable. So this is the reason that we always recommend to perform authentication, because without authenticating on those assets, for example, I wouldn't be able to see if that my wget is vulnerable. And if I don't elevate my credentials, maybe my scanner would not be able to run this command and return everything. So just keep in mind. And the equivalent for Windows machines would be to read the Windows registry. So any vulnerability scanner, it's very interested to be able to read those keys in here. So if they cannot elevate the credential as domain administrator, local administrator, they won't be able to do a full service software fingerprint and then perform a full vulnerability fingerprint. I think that's it for this video. Thanks so much. And the next video probably gonna talk about dashboards.